In 1967, also setting the lap record at the time, was one of those, no doubt whatsoever, that American effort can be competitive. American effort can be more than competitive, it can be winning. People often assume that the drivers I admired most were the ones who won the most races. That's never been true. Some of the men I'm about to talk about became world champions. One never did. Their careers weren't identical. Their personalities couldn't have been more different, and they approached racing in completely different ways. Yet every one of them left me walking away from a circuit thinking, I need to be better next time. That's what admiration has always meant to me. It isn't about being intimidated. It isn't about agreeing with everything another driver says or does. It's about recognizing a quality so exceptional that even a competitor has no choice but to respect it. Sometimes it was breathtaking car control. Sometimes it was remarkable discipline. Sometimes it was the ability to stay calm when everyone else was falling apart. And occasionally it was simply character. I raced in an era when Formula One demanded everything from a driver. The cars were unpredictable, the circuits were unforgiving, and every season reminded us how fragile this sport could be. Against that backdrop, earning another driver's admiration meant far more than earning his applause. When I think about everyone I shared the track with, 5 names still stand above the rest, not because they defined Formula One, but because they helped define the driver I became. The first name that comes to mind is Jim Clark. I don't think anyone who raced against him or even watched him closely could ever forget what it looked like when he was completely in rhythm with a racing car. There was nothing dramatic about the way he drove. No unnecessary corrections. No obvious struggle. It almost looked too easy, and that's exactly what made it so extraordinary. I first got to know Jim during the early 1960s when both of us were trying to establish ourselves at the highest level of the sport. Formula One was changing quickly, and Team Lotus had become one of the most innovative outfits in the paddock. Jim was at the center of it all, but if you met him away from the circuit, you would never have guessed he was the man everyone was chasing. He was quiet, modest, and almost uncomfortable with the attention that followed him. There wasn't a trace of arrogance in him. What made Jim so remarkable wasn't simply that he was fast. Plenty of drivers were fast over one lap. Jim possessed something much rarer. He could find the absolute limit of a car without ever appearing to force it there. Watching him through a sequence of corners was like watching someone who already knew what the car wanted before the car itself did. His steering inputs were gentle, his throttle control was effortless, and somehow the car always seemed calmer beneath him than it did beneath anyone else. I remember the 1965 season especially well. Jim didn't just dominate Formula One by winning 6 of the 10 championship races he entered that year. Just days after winning the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, he traveled to America and conquered the Indianapolis 500, becoming the first driver in decades to win it with a rear-engined car. As someone who loved racing on both sides of the Atlantic, I understood better than most how extraordinary that achievement really was. Winning at Spa demanded one set of skills. Winning Indianapolis demanded another entirely. Jim mastered both almost effortlessly. Racing against him forced me to become more honest with myself. There were weekends when I believed I had driven close to perfectly, only to see Jim find another few tenths that nobody else could explain. Instead of frustrating me, it made me curious. I started paying closer attention to how I prepared, how I approached qualifying, and how I managed a race over its full distance. Jim reminded me that smoothness wasn't the opposite of speed. In many cases, it was the very reason speed existed. His career ended far too soon in 1968, and I often wonder what more he could have accomplished had he been given the time. But perhaps that's why his legacy has never faded. We never saw him decline. We only saw brilliance interrupted. I've raced many exceptional drivers in my life, but whenever someone asks me what pure natural talent looked like behind the wheel of a Formula One car, Jim Clark is still the first face that appears in my memory. The next driver on my list is Jackie Stewart, And in many ways, he couldn't have been more different from Jim Clark. If Jim represented effortless elegance behind the wheel, Jackie represented preparation, discipline, and relentless attention to detail. Watching him race taught me that Formula One wasn't won by talent alone. Sometimes it was won long before the cars ever rolled out of the garage. When Jackie arrived in Formula One during the mid-1960s, people noticed his speed almost immediately. But what impressed me wasn't simply how fast he adapted. It was how methodically he approached every part of his job. He wanted to understand everything. He questioned engineers, he studied circuits, he paid attention to details that many drivers of our generation simply accepted without thinking twice. At a time when instinct ruled the sport, Jackie was already treating racing like a science. What made him so difficult to compete against wasn't raw aggression. In fact, Jackie rarely looked like he was driving on the edge. The challenge was that he almost never wasted anything. Every lap had a purpose. Every adjustment had a reason. He understood how to preserve his tires, protect his machinery, and still maintain relentless pace over an entire Grand Prix. You couldn't expect him to make careless mistakes because he had already thought several corners ahead. One race that has stayed with me for decades was the 1968 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. The conditions were miserable. Heavy rain covered one of the longest and most intimidating circuits in the world, a place already known as the Green Hell long before any of us arrived that weekend. Most drivers spent the afternoon simply trying to survive. Jackie did something entirely different. He won the race by more than 4 minutes over the rest of the field. Even by the standards of that era, it was an astonishing display of control. That afternoon wasn't about bravery alone, it was about judgment. Jackie always seemed to know exactly where the limit was, even when nobody else could see it. There was another reason I admired him that had nothing to do with lap times. Jackie was one of the first drivers willing to publicly challenge Formula One's attitude towards safety. In those days, many believed accepting danger was simply part of being a racing driver. Fatal accidents happened with heartbreaking regularity, and too often the sport carried on as though nothing had changed. Jackie refused to accept that. He spoke openly about improving barriers, medical facilities, martial training, and circuit standards, even when some people accused him of trying to make Formula One less heroic. Looking back now, history proved he was right. The changes he fought for saved lives, including the lives of drivers who may never have realized they owed him that debt. That took a different kind of courage than diving into a fast corner. It meant standing against tradition while knowing many of your own competitors disagreed with you. Jackie made me appreciate that being a great racing driver wasn't only about what happened between the start and finish lines. It was also about taking responsibility for the future of the sport itself. I admired his intelligence every bit as much as his speed, and decades later, I still think Formula One is stronger because Jackie Stewart refused to accept that danger had to remain part of its identity. Then there's Graham Hill, a man who proved that personality and competitiveness could exist in perfect balance. If you only met Graham away from the racetrack, you'd probably remember his sense of humor before anything else. He was charming, quick with a joke, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who genuinely enjoyed life. But once the visor came down, that warmth disappeared. Behind the wheel, he became one of the toughest competitors any of us could hope to face. I always admired the way Graham carried himself in Formula One. He understood that being a racing driver meant representing more than just yourself. Sponsors, mechanics, journalists, and fans all gravitated toward him because he made the sport feel approachable without ever compromising his professionalism. That wasn't an easy balance to strike during our era, and very few drivers managed it as naturally as he did. What made Graham so exceptional wasn't explosive speed over a single lap. It was his ability to think through an entire Grand Prix. He understood patience better than almost anyone. While some drivers attacked every corner as though qualifying never ended, Graham always seemed to know when to push and when to wait. He had an extraordinary sense of race rhythm. He could spend dozens of laps applying pressure without forcing a mistake of his own, patiently waiting for someone else to make theirs. There was no better example than Monaco. Even before people began calling him Mr. Monaco, the streets seemed perfectly suited to the way he drove. Winning there once requires talent. Winning there 5 times during the 1960s required something much deeper. Monaco punished impatience more severely than any circuit we raced. There was no room for recovery if you clipped a barrier or missed an apex by inches. Graham treated every lap like a carefully planned conversation with the circuit itself. Watching him thread a Formula One car through those narrow streets was a masterclass in precision. I remember racing against him knowing that beating Graham wasn't simply about finding another tenth of a second. You had to outthink him over 2 hours of competition. If tire wear became an issue, Graham usually anticipated it before everyone else. If changing weather altered the balance of the race, he adapted with remarkable composure. He rarely appeared flustered because he had already considered possibilities that most of us were only beginning to recognize. Our careers also crossed paths beyond Formula One, and that gave me an even greater appreciation for what he accomplished. Graham remains the only driver to complete motorsport's Triple Crown by winning the Monaco Grand Prix, the Indianapolis 500, and the 24 Hours of Le Mans. As someone fortunate enough to win both the Formula One Grand Prix and the Indianapolis 500, I understood just how different those worlds were. Excelling in one discipline was difficult enough. Mastering all three demanded an extraordinary range of skills and an openness to constantly learning. Perhaps what I admired most was that Graham never allowed success to make him complacent. Even after becoming world champion twice, he continued approaching races with the curiosity of someone who still believed there was more to discover. That attitude stayed with me. Championships eventually become part of history, but the willingness to keep improving never goes out of style. Whenever I think about Graham Hill, I don't just remember a brilliant racing driver. I remember a man who showed that confidence didn't have to become arrogance, that fierce competition didn't require bitterness, and that a true champion could earn admiration long before the checkered flag ever fell. Then there was Juan Manuel Fangio. I didn't spend years fighting wheel to wheel with him the way I did with some of the others on this list, but that never diminished the admiration I felt. By the time I reached Formula One, Fangio had already become the standard every ambitious driver measured himself against. His influence was everywhere. You could hear mechanics mention his feedback, engineers quote his observations, and veteran drivers tell stories about races that sounded almost impossible. Long before I truly knew him, I already understood that I was following a path he had helped create. Meeting Fangio only reinforced that impression. There was nothing intimidating about him in person. He wasn't loud. He didn't try to dominate a room. In fact, he listened more than he spoke. But when he did offer an opinion about a racing car or a circuit, everyone paid attention. That kind of respect isn't earned through reputation alone. It's earned because time after time, you've proven your judgment is worth trusting. What made Fangio so extraordinary wasn't simply that he won 5 world championships, a record that stood for nearly half a century. It was the way he approached racing. He understood that speed was only one piece of the puzzle. He believed a driver had to understand the machine beneath him as thoroughly as the engineers who built it. If the car developed understeer halfway through a race, or the brakes began fading, Fangio adjusted instinctively. He never seemed surprised by what a race threw at him because he had already imagined every possibility before the lights went out. Whenever people talk about Fangio, I inevitably think of the 1957 German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring. He was already 46 years old, an age when many believed a racing driver's best days were behind him. After an unscheduled pit stop dropped him well behind the Ferraris of Mike Hawthorne and Peter Collins, most observers assumed the race was over. Instead, Fangio produced one of the greatest recovery drives our sport has ever seen. Lap after lap, he shattered the existing lap record, caught both Ferraris, passed them, and secured another world championship. Even years later, drivers still talked about that afternoon with genuine disbelief. It wasn't just fast. It was almost unimaginable. That race taught me something important. Fangio never seemed to panic. Whether he was leading comfortably or chasing impossible odds, his decisions remained calm. Many drivers become faster when they're desperate, but desperation often leads to mistakes. Fangio was different. The greater the pressure became, the clearer his thinking appeared. That ability separated him from almost everyone else who climbed into a Formula One car. I also admired the humility he carried despite everything he had accomplished. You would expect someone with 5 world championships to constantly remind people of his achievements. Fangio never needed to. He understood that respect grows naturally when you let your work speak for itself. That quiet confidence left a lasting impression on me throughout my own career. It reminded me that the strongest competitors rarely feel the need to announce how strong they are. I've often thought that every generation has one driver who becomes more than a champion. He becomes a reference point. And for my generation and for many that followed, Fangio was exactly that. We didn't admire him because of the statistics, remarkable as they were. We admired him because he demonstrated what complete mastery of this sport truly looked like. Even decades later, when I picture the ideal racing driver, part of that image still belongs to Juan Manuel Fangio. The final name on my list is Stirling Moss, and I have a feeling some people will wonder why I chose a man who never won a Formula One World Championship. My answer has always been simple. Championships tell one story. Drivers tell another. If admiration depended only on titles, then this conversation would be far less interesting. Stirling was one of the most naturally gifted racers I ever knew. Unlike many of us, he didn't seem interested in proving himself in just one category of motorsport. If it had wheels and someone was keeping time, he wanted to drive it. Formula One, sports cars, touring cars, endurance races, hill climbs, rally events, it didn't seem to matter. He approached every challenge with the same enthusiasm and somehow found a way to be competitive almost immediately. What made him so extraordinary wasn't simply his adaptability. It was his absolute commitment the moment the visor came down. Stirling drove with an intensity that was impossible to ignore, but it was never reckless for the sake of entertainment. He understood exactly how much risk he was taking, and he accepted it because that was simply part of racing during our era. You always knew that if Moss was in the field, nobody could afford an easy afternoon. One of the moments that has always stayed with me happened during the 1958 Portuguese Grand Prix. Stirling won the race while Mike Hawthorne finished second after initially being threatened with disqualification for restarting his stalled Ferrari the wrong way after a spin. Most drivers in Stirling's position would have quietly accepted the decision. After all, removing Hawthorne from the results would have strengthened their own championship hopes. Instead, Stirling spoke to the stewards and explained that Hawthorne had actually pushed the car onto an escape road before restarting, making his actions legal under the regulations. His testimony reversed the decision and restored Hawthorne's points. Months later, Hawthorne won the World Championship by a single point. That meant Stirling's honesty may very well have cost him the only Formula One World Championship he ever had a chance to win. I've thought about that story many times over the years because it revealed something far more important than driving ability. Stirling believed that winning meant very little if it wasn't earned the right way. He valued fairness more than personal gain, even when the consequences were enormous. That's an incredibly difficult choice for any competitor to make, especially when a championship is on the line. His career was filled with spectacular victories, including unforgettable performances in the Mille Miglia, the Monaco Grand Prix, and countless races across Europe. Yet, whenever I think about Stirling Moss, I don't immediately picture a trophy. I picture integrity. I picture someone who loved racing so deeply that protecting its spirit mattered just as much as beating the driver beside him. Looking back now, I honestly believe history has treated Sterling kindly. People rarely introduce him as the greatest driver never to become world champion anymore. They simply call him one of the greatest racing drivers who ever lived. I think that's a much more fitting description. Championships can depend on machinery, luck, or timing. Character doesn't. And if there's one lesson Sterling Moss left for every driver who came after him, it's that the respect you earn from your competitors can outlast any title you'll ever win. Looking back now, I don't remember these 5 men simply because of the races they won. I remember them because each one changed the way I understood Formula One. Jim Clark taught me the beauty of effortless speed. Jackie Stewart showed me that preparation and intelligence could be just as powerful as bravery. Graham Hill proved that class and competitiveness could exist in the same person. Juan Manuel Fangio set a standard that every generation has been chasing ever since. And Sterling Moss reminded all of us that character can outlive any championship. People often ask what the golden age of Formula One was like. I usually tell them it wasn't golden because of the cars, it was golden because of the people. I was fortunate enough to race alongside men who challenged me, inspired me, and raised the standard every time they climbed into the cockpit. If I had the chance to live it all again, I'd still choose the same path. The risks were real, but so were the friendships, the rivalries, and the lessons that stayed with me long after the checkered flag. That's the thing about racing. Victories become statistics, championships become history, but the drivers you truly admire become part of your story forever.